Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zoya Pavlovskaya, and I'm a lecturer in business at Penn State University, Brandywine campus in Media, Pennsylvania. And we are hosting a webinar today on fair trade. This event is hosted by Chancellor's Commission on Sustainability on our campus, as well as Media Fair Trade. And I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today, who is Billy Goldsmith. And please introduce yourself, Billy, and we are so happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be with you. And we've got a intimate group, so I'll move through the presentation. It may be stuff that a lot of you are familiar with. It's kind of an overview of what fair trade is, how it works, and our fair trade campaigns movement. To start off, I wanted to just share a land acknowledgement that I and many of us live and operate on unceded Lenape Nation land. And we all owe a great debt to the people that occupied these regions before us. My name, as Zoe mentioned, is Billy Linstead Goldsmith. I'm the Senior Director of Communications at Fair Trade USA, as well as the Director of Fair Trade Campaigns, and have been in the fair trade movement just about 15 years now. And before that, worked with a large nonprofit environmental advocacy organization that fights for clean and healthy, safe drinking water and access to clean waterways for communities across the U.S. So that led me naturally into advocacy around fair trade as I expanded my awareness of international justice and issues around international poverty, and so was able to have the opportunity to join the fair trade movement back in 2009. So I'll share a presentation right now. Like I said, it's a little bit kind of an overview of fair trade and fair trade campaigns. And then I'd love to just facilitate a conversation, see what questions everyone has, and things of that nature. So if you can confirm that you can see my screen, great. All right, so let's get started on basics. So why fair trade? Global poverty is, if not one of the absolute most pressing issues that we face as a global community. The first of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is no poverty for a reason. And according to UN and World Bank numbers, we are now at 660 million people living in extreme poverty. That's 8.5% of the world population. And that's under $2.15 a day. And almost a full quarter of the world's population is living on under $3.65 a day. 75% of those folks who are working poor are in agriculture, and another 20% in industry, which is not a lot of click down data on what that means. But for our purposes, we certify factories as well to protect factory workers and ensure additional benefits of fair trade for folks working in factory settings. So that's why those two stats are called out there. And the more we learn about the drivers of global poverty, the more we're able to address them. And the way fair trade operates is kind of three areas of impact. If you think about sustainability and the sustainability movement globally and in this country, for a long, long time, 30, 35 years of that movement, sustainability really was equated with environmental protection and environmental sustainability, which is incredibly important, is a driver of poverty, is a driver as we see the climate crisis advance of continued inequities and just degradation of the natural environment. That said, if you think about sustainability as a tripod, one leg being environmental, one being social sustainability, and one being economic sustainability, by investing so much time and energy into environmentalism, we essentially built an unsustainable sustainability movement because the environmental leg of the tripod is 100 feet tall and the other two are 10 feet tall. And so one of the added values that fair trade seeks to bring to the broader global sustainability movement is increasing the importance and emphasis on social and economic sustainability. An example of why that is important is because of those numbers we saw a minute ago, 75% of the world's working poor are in agriculture. There's an incredible opportunity for those workers and those farmers to contribute to mitigating the circumstances that lead to climate change, to actively be partners in the world's efforts to save the environment and save the planet. And if you are putting yourselves in the shoes of a farmer living in abject poverty, you quickly realize that you don't really have the luxury of considering what kind of chemicals you're putting into the ground or how much forest you're clearing if you don't know where your kid's next meal is coming from. Or if you yourself have not eaten more than a bowl of rice in 3 days so that your kids and family can eat. So we cannot solve these pressing environmental crises that we're facing without also addressing economic and social sustainability. And that's what fair trade standards do. They address all three of those. You can see some examples of that. Economic is ensuring a safety net on a lot of the products in fair trade, a minimum price that's set more or less around this cost of production to make sure that the cost of production is being covered and that families can lift themselves out of poverty. They're not subsistence farming. Long-term contracts and honoring those contracts are an important part of fair trade, as is transparency and an additional amount of money that goes to communities that they determine themselves how to invest and what to invest in to meet their most pressing needs. And that leads into social. In the standards for fair trade, there are strict guidelines and rules around social sustainability and social safety nets. You can see a few of those things linked there or listed there. I could share the full standard around social impact, but it would take probably 3 of these calls. So all of the standards that you might be interested in diving into and learning about are all publicly available on the website of the major fair trade certifiers. I'll share some of those names in a minute. Encourage folks with any questions about kind of the breadth and depth of those to go check those standards out. They're a little wonky, but they're not the worst technical documents you'll ever read. And then finally is a very high importance placed on environmental sustainability within fair trade standards. The vast majority of fair trade products that are certified come from agricultural settings. Again, agricultural settings are some of the most opportune places for us to build more resiliency for environmental impacts and for climate change. And so there's a lot in the standards around those issues and what farmers and farm workers can do to help ensure that we're building sustainable supply chains that start with sustainable soil and sustainable land. The other big piece that I mentioned a second ago are community development funds. So for every product sold through a certified fair trade supply chain, a pool of money is returned back to the workers and farmers themselves. It's a separate bank account. It is not managed by farm owners or even larger entities that those farms may be a part of. They are provided to those fair trade committees, which are elected democratically by their fellow farmers and workers, who then do a needs assessment, determine what are the kind of projects that the community, that the workers, that the farmers may need. And then it goes to a vote. And everybody who is a participant in the fair trade program and their families vote on the projects that they want to invest in. And then they build a project plan and they implement. You can see some of these. There is no shortage of impact stories from community development funds in fair trade. It is one of the most tangible, visible ways that fair trade can lead to generational change and generational impact. Ira was with me visiting farms many years ago, where we met kids who were now working at the co-op after graduating college. They were the first kids from the community to ever go to college on scholarships provided by the Fair Trade Premium Fund, after going to high school and being the first kids in the community to go to high school using scholarship funds invested in by the Fair Trade Premium. So, it really is something that we see impact far beyond what's even traditionally measurable. The ripple effects of this type of impact is in some ways unquantifiable. Another piece of that is just the democratic process that gets established to be part of the fair trade system. So, in a lot of the communities that fair trade is benefiting, workers are not used to having a voice. Farmers are not used to having good access to data and to international pricing and markets and things of that nature. And so the mere function of standing up premium committees that are voted on by their community, that then tap into resources to help determine some of these projects, that bring that back for a vote, gives a voice to folks who have largely been voiceless in the supply chain for a long time. And just that also delivers some of that ripple effect impact. This is kind of a flow of impact diagram just to help visualize how the money moves and how farmers and workers benefit from the fair trade system. And it starts with whether it's a factory, a fishery, or in most cases, a large farm or a cooperative, getting certified, ensuring that the fair trade standards are being met, standing up those committees, worker bodies, organizing, and starting their path towards full compliance um, with the standard. And then that from there goes to market partners that are sourcing from those farms and factories, labeling products, remitting the fair trade premium and the payments for the products. Consumers buy the products, and then all of that flows back to the farmers and workers. And again, they are voting on how to utilize that money after their committees conduct a needs assessment. And then the community invests that and builds their schools or stands up their scholarship funds or clinics or brings, rotating medical providers in or whatever the community has determined to be their greatest need. And then the role of certifiers. Certifiers or verifiers. These are the four main labels and actors that, as far as fair trade campaigns goes, are included when we count what fair trade products are available on a campus or in a community. They're similar but different. This fair trade label, the black one, comes from Europe and the UK. That's predominantly where you see that label. That label has entered the US market about, I'm losing track of time after all these years, 6 years ago, I think. And so you'll start to see that you've started to see this label more and more on the shelf with Fair Trade America underneath it. This is Fair Trade Certified. This is the longest running and largest certifier in the US market and actually in North America. This certification is conveyed by Fair Trade USA, which in full disclosure, I am an employee of Fair Trade USA. And Fair Trade USA has been the organizational home to fair trade campaigns since 2009. The Fair Trade Federation, this is a brand new logo, so you have likely not seen this. I thought about putting both the old and new one on there so you can tell, but I didn't have room on the slide. Fair Trade Federation is an incredible organization. They're essentially a trade association for companies that are 100% committed to fair trade. So this is not for every company. Lots of companies sell a small to large percentage of their products on fair trade terms or sources them. Fair Trade Federation is a space for those who are fully committed to fair trade. And so they provide resources and they have a lot of retailers that are part of the FTF community. 10,000 Villages, who's on this call, is a founding member of the Fair Trade Federation. We've worked closely with them for many, many years. And then this last one is Fair for Life. It is much smaller. I don't mean in the size of the label, but much smaller in terms of its footprint on products in the US. And that certification is more than just the supply chain. So the Fair for Life label audits not only the supply chain, which is primarily what Fair Trade International and Fair Trade Certified do, but they also audit the business practices of the company itself. So what kind of pay do they provide to their employees? What benefits do they have? All of that. And so their label seeks to both certify the supply chain, but also lend its credibility to the actual company itself that might be based in the US or in Canada. And so what these actors do in the market is, for those that certify, we certify farms, factories, and fisheries. We register the mid supply chain actors, right? Because it's not just that coffee goes from the farm to your favorite coffee company. It's imported by importers and traders. It's manufactured by a roaster if that coffee company doesn't do their own roasting. And all of those folks are important parts of the supply chain to maintain traceability and measurement across the brands that work with these companies and then put their labels on their products, and then work with retailers to try to highlight at retail what fair trade products are available, where do they sit on the shelf, how do retailers kind of sell fair trade forward in the same way that you have come to see, a whole entire aisles at traditional grocery stores dedicated to organic, those types of things. And then finally engaging consumers and making sure that folks are aware of fair trade, understand what it means and why it's a great opportunity to make an impact with your everyday purchases. And this is just Fair Trade USA. We work with over 1,500 industry partners. You'd see the Fair Trade certified label on products from all of these brands. This is just a sample of some of the brands and retailers, and each of those certifiers and organizations has a list of all of the businesses that they partner with that are bringing fair trade products to market. Let me stop there and just see if anybody has questions around how fair trade works, the fair trade system, and then I'll get briefly into the fair trade campaigns movement.
Billy, it seems like we have two questions in chat. So
Oh, great.
Elizabeth,
Yeah, I can't.
would you like to maybe voice your question? I just read it out loud.
Billy, I asked if any of the other certifiers other than Fair Trade USA help fund fair trade campaigns.
No.
That's
Nor
terrible.
ever have. 100% of the funding for fair trade campaigns comes from Fair Trade USA. That includes, grant making that we do for fair trade campaigns.
Right.
But yeah, it's entirely funded and operated by Fair Trade USA. That said, it's important for us to have an inclusive movement. And so, as Elizabeth knows, fair trade campaigns started at the grassroots level. It didn't start at Fair Trade USA. It started in Media, Pennsylvania with Elizabeth and a few friends who learned about this movement that had started in the UK and was spreading across Europe. And then it slowly started spreading, across the US. And that group of early organizers formed a steering committee to help provide some governance and some resourcing as more and more interest was coming in, and then ultimately put a call for proposals out to some of those different organizations in the fair trade movement to see who might adopt the program, bring it on, fund it, staff it. And that was the proposal that was ultimately accepted was Fair Trade USA's. And that staffing ultimately was me. So that's where all that comes from.
It's a disappointment that the others haven't contributed.
It's been a struggle, not just in the U.S., but globally as well. I've chaired the International Fair Trade Town Steering Committee I just moved from chair after about a decade chairing that group to just serving as a member on that International Steering Committee. And for whatever reason, funding has always been a challenge, even from the organizations that benefit the most from grassroots advocacy of their labels and endorsement to invest in people, individuals and consumers and institutions in purchasing their products.
Thank you, Billy. Ira also has a question. Ira, can you please?
Yeah, I'm not going to ask my question I put in the chat. That was just sort of to raise a chuckle. But Billy, I have this question. So I learned a few years ago at one of the fair trade conferences where they mentioned that the money that fair trade farmers are getting is not a living wage, and you mentioned to raise them out of poverty and something about so they're not subsistence farmers. I don't really understand the difference between all that. Is that something you can speak to? That's probably like a much deeper question, but I don't know what the difference between a subsistence farmer is. How that.
Yeah. I mean, I can give some broad definitions and speak to some of the work going on globally that multiple fair trade organizations, including us, are a part of. So subsistence farming is where you don't make anything more than what it costs to grow and harvest the products that you're farming. So absolutely zero profit. You are just part of the agricultural machine. You're not really benefiting from that. Sure, you get paid for your harvest, but then that gets reinvested right back into your next harvest and buying seeds and caring for the land and all of that. So subsistence farming is extreme poverty farming, and extreme poverty agriculture. A living wage is something that is incredibly complex to calculate and benchmark because of the local context and the local minimum wage being one of the driving factors for determining what a living wage is what's the baseline at the national level. In a lot of countries, there's a national minimum wage that agricultural workers are exempted from. In the US, we have a national minimum wage. Migrant agricultural workers are exempt from our federal labor laws in many cases. So they do not automatically get a minimum wage in the US. So there's an organization called the Global Living Wage Coalition that has been doing deep research for, I'd say, like the last 4 or 5 years on how to potentially create a true living wage benchmark by country or by region. We're part of that coalition, as is Fair Trade International and a huge range of organizations. This is far beyond fair trade. And that's working to determine, what is the calculus for accurately determining what a living or a livable wage is in a local context. And so fair trade, at least minimally, tries to bridge that gap. There is no guarantee of a living wage in fair trade. That is, again, partly because that benchmark isn't fully developed yet, but also I think the belief among fair trade organizations is that we are not the ones who are best positioned to credibly determine what a living wage is. There are certainly economists that work in fair trade, but that's the work of that coalition. And it would be premature to jump to a number that a coalition that we're a part of might come to differently, within a couple of years. So the minimum price is estimated to reflect the cost of production, so that when markets drop in those commodities, people are not making less than the cost of production. Does that make sense? So I'll say that again, right? So a lot of these agricultural products, coffee is a perfect case study, is traded on global markets. The global C price changes daily. And if your cost of production is $1.35 per pound of coffee produced, if the market drops to 80 cents a pound, you're being driven off your land. I mean, you can't, that's below subsistence farming, right? That's going into debt just to grow the crops that you grow, just to grow and cultivate your coffee. So the minimum price is a safety net that ensures that you are never making less than it's X percent above the cost of production, because it has to be above subsistence farming. Even that calculation, to be completely honest, Ira, is difficult, because cost of production, a global minimum price can't really ensure covering cost of production everywhere, because cost of production is different everywhere. Just like how you might define a living wage is different everywhere. Cost of production for a small coffee farmer in Nicaragua could be wildly different than that of a small coffee farmer in Indonesia or in Ethiopia. It varies farm to farm, but it's a best guess. It's a best shot at making sure that farmers at the minimum price are making above the cost of production. And ultimately, they trade on the market. So when the market is above the minimum price, they get the market rate. If their coffee is of exceptional quality, they're getting way above that anyway, because the market will always pay a premium for higher quality products. So that's a kind of a basic economics of how it all works. And then again, in addition to that, pricing is the fair trade premium, which is a total separate bucket of money. That is not coming out of money that would go to workers' pay or go to farmers for their harvest. That's additional money.
Yeah, great. That's a lot of insight. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other kind of general fair trade questions?
Well, you just brought up something else. That I read an article recently. It was like it's between direct trade and fair trade, and I swear it's like kind of the conclusion said that direct trade is more about the quality of the product, and I was a little bit surprised about that. Do you have anything to say to that?
Direct trade is a model of, the company going directly to origin, wherever the coffee is coming from, and meeting with the farmers that grow some of that coffee, finding out in many cases, what is the best quality coffee. And in many cases, it pays more than like the fair trade minimum price. You can't ever credibly say it pays more than fair trade, because coffee is traded based on its quality. So there's no way to credibly say that a coffee company that's doing direct trade is always paying farmers more than a coffee company doing fair trade. That those are all agreements made between those parties. What is different is that there is no certifier or third-party verifier of direct trade. So essentially, you are taking the company's word for it. That is it. There's no validation, there's no third party. And we would argue at fair trade, in the fair trade movement, that that is one of the most important mechanisms of fair trade. We have taken companies' word that they're doing the right thing for a long, long time globally, and we're dealing with the problems we're dealing with globally. Credibility is so much more reliant or reliable when there is a third party validating and auditing your supply chain. So that is what maybe the biggest difference. The other thing is that, you know, we have definitely seen challenging circumstances for farmers with direct trade relationships, because the vast majority, I think it's 92% of fair trade certified coffee globally comes from small farmer owned cooperatives. And the whole model of the co-op is that farmers bring their coffee to the co-op. The co-op aggregates and sells their coffee and then delivers that revenue back to the farmers, or pays the farmers when they deliver, their coffee. Direct trade essentially goes in, finds the best coffee available, and creates a direct relationship with those small farmers, which removes them from the cooperative. The cooperative model is not built to also accommodate side deals with other companies who are paying more money. So not only does that extract some of the highest quality coffee from the overall cooperative's quality profile, it also builds a system of reliance between those farmers and one company. And if that company goes out of business, they are now no longer part of the cooperative, and they don't have a market partner to sell their coffee to. So there can be unintended consequences through the direct trade model, because it operates under the assumption that the company is going to stay viable and is going to be enough of a market partner for that farmer to not need or be part of the cooperative. So that's a risk inherent in the direct trade model. And also, some farmers make a lot more money via the direct trade model, and I will never begrudge farmers and workers from getting the money that they can get. For the most part, direct traders insist on sustainability. So, personally, when I see direct trade, I don't have concerns as much about the on the ground environmental impacts and things of that nature. A lot of those companies are also doing things like regenerative ag programs and things of that nature. But again, ultimately, it's just what the company tells you. There's nobody verifying or validating that. All right, so let me just run through these last few slides. This is much more relevant to the Fair Trade Campaigns movement, which is the grassroots arm of the Fair Trade movement. As we were saying just a couple of minutes ago, it started in the UK by a friend of Elizabeth, Ira, and mine named Bruce Crowther, who was an Oxfam organizer. Back in the 90s, Oxfam was a heavy state organizational stakeholder in the Fair Trade movement. And one of the kind of early authors of how fair trade got to be more mainstream. And Bruce was really passionate about fair trade and wanted to figure out how he could deepen his community's commitment to fair trade. It wasn't called this then, but started what became known as Fair Trade Towns and the Fair Trade Towns movement. That is how this is all bucketed globally. Across the world, there are fair trade towns, fair trade congregations, fair trade schools, fair trade islands, fair trade colleges and universities, fair trade counties. There are 2 fair trade nations. There are fair trade kind of fill in the blank. In the US, it started with fair trade towns and media. And then within about 3 or 4 years, we saw the first activity on college and university campuses. That program was formalized in 2010. And then in 2015, at a strategic planning meeting in media with our national steering committee governance group, we decided to launch fair trade schools and fair trade congregations, sort of as stepping stones towards fair trade towns and fair trade schools, fair trade colleges and universities, excuse me. So that's kind of the growth and the arc of the program. These are our current numbers, 236 active campaigns around the country. At our peak pre-COVID, we were over 300 campaigns. We were holding incredible national conferences with 400 to 500 attendees, with incredible speakers. Our last one was in 2020. That was scheduled to be the weekend of March 24th, 2020. If anybody remembers what happened in the week preceding March 24th of 2020, you'd see why we had to shift dramatically and quickly to a digital conference, and have yet to convene another one. But they were really incredible events that folks who have been to can attest. Really work. Fair trade campaign's goal is to really build a more diverse, inclusive fair trade movement, and that's reflected in the multiple labels that we recognize, as well as our approach to developing advocacy programs. So, for a fair trade college and university, skip a slide. There are 5 goals to become a fair trade town or a fair trade college and university, and they're built around raising awareness among members of the community, around product availability, because there's not a lot of point in informing people what fair trade is and why it's important if they don't know where they can buy it, as well as getting buy-in from your governing body on a college campus. That's usually the president's office, often going through faculty or student senates as well, before landing there. But you've always got to build a team. This is not the work of one individual person. Everybody brings the needed range of skills and talent to the table. Ensuring product availability on a college and university campus. That means any campus owned and operated outlet needs to have a minimum of 2 fair trade products available. Using fair trade products at the institutional level. So the availability on campus owned and operated outlets is kind of the consumer perspective for the individual students and individual faculty that are buying things on campus. This next one is the use of fair trade products across campus. So in offices, in campus catering, at campus events, those types of things. Ensuring a commitment to and demonstrating a commitment to education and awareness. That usually looks like campus-facing events during the course of the semester. This could count as one of those types, bringing fair trade into the classroom, as well as things like film screenings and fair trade fairs. And every year at the end of the semester, every semester we have the Fair Trade Finals program, where teams can set up a fair trade coffee station outside of a library where people are going to study. We try to provide some options as well for kind of preset programming. And then the fair trade resolution, which really cements the institution or the community's commitment to fair trade. So for colleges and universities, we're over 100 of those active around the country. You can see on the map here where a lot of them are located, and on our website, which is just fairtradecampaigns.org. This map is interactive. As you can see, you can sort by the different types of campaigns, drill down into your region and your area. That's also true of the map on the main homepage, which shows all of our campaigns, regardless of type. And a wonderful example of a fair trade university is Penn State Brandywine, which is a fair trade university. And you can see what the Penn State Brandywine page looks like here. These are the 5 goals. It's an interactive website. So you start a campaign, you have a back-end access where you upload all of the evidence as to how you're meeting those goals. And then these sliders kind of progress as you go until they are completed and you are a fair trade university. And then, our website is just a hub of resources for anybody that's looking to grow the movement, get involved, meet more people, connect with others, learn from others, and help drive this important movement forward. So that's fair trade campaigns. Many of the folks on this call are fair trade campaigners, which is wonderful. Philadelphia is a fair trade city. Actually, 4 of the 6 biggest cities. I always have to check if Philly and Phoenix go back and forth on which one is bigger every year, or every couple of years. But of the biggest cities in the country, Houston is a fair trade town, Chicago is a fair trade town, Philadelphia is a fair trade town. Did I say Los Angeles already? Los Angeles is a fair trade town. New York is slow going, but they're trying to go borough by borough. So there's a campaign for Manhattan and a campaign for Brooklyn to become fair trade towns before the entire city does. So yeah, we've seen great momentum over the years. We're working to rebuild that coming out of the pandemic, which was obviously really challenging for a program built on person-to-person advocacy, in-person events, in-person meetings, all of those things. So we had to pivot pretty radically during COVID, but we sustained, which I think everybody in the movement is really proud of, that we were able to keep this movement vibrant as we moved through those months and years, and now as we're thankfully slowly kind of emerging from the pandemic, we're starting to see that momentum pick back up. So I will leave it there and would love to chat about anything anybody would like to speak about.
Billy, I'm so eager to know how certification is going. Before COVID, certification was always on a rise, but what did COVID do to fair trade? Sales, certification sales, and the like.
Yeah, I mean, sales maintained and actually increased in some product categories. I mean, one of the I don't want to even use the word benefit when we talk about the pandemic, but one of the unexpected outcomes of the pandemic was people were sitting at home and thinking about what they were buying in a different way. Right, everybody's life kind of slowed down or came to a grinding halt, and I think what we've seen from trends around growth of kind of conscientious consumers, has actually increased during COVID. So there was a pretty big spike in things like fair trade produce, fresh fruits and vegetables, for example, saw like a 20-something% increase in purchasing through the pandemic. Again, I think that was people not rushing through the grocery store to get from one place to the other, but sitting there on their phones on Instacart or however, whatever app they were using, with more time on their hands that they knew what to do with, really actually looking at this stuff, for the first time. It can be challenging in a busy, retail grocery store to really get an understanding of what you're buying, other than just checking everything you need off the list to feed yourself or your family or your friends. So we saw an increase there. We saw an increase in some of the factory products, right? Some of the apparel and home goods actually increased in terms of sales, and then others decreased. And there's lots of reasons for that. Coffee is an example. A bag of coffee can last a long time. And even though people reported drinking more over the course of the day during the pandemic, I think there was like a momentary surge, and then people realized how geeked out they were on caffeine, and then there was a corresponding drop, present company included. So I think that there's all kinds of studies that are just starting to come out around like what were the drivers of consumer behavior during the worst of the pandemic. So it was a little bit of a roller coaster, but there were some positive trends. What we've seen post-COVID is a much faster return to work in fair trade settings, right? So factories, for example, the factory sector was decimated during COVID, right? There is not the level of automation in factories that allows for the number of people having to stay home. And some of the factories in the apparel sector that came back online the fastest because they had the infrastructure to ensure PPE for workers and testing and treatment and all of those were fair trade certified factories. And so we saw a lot of really positive post-pandemic outcomes of fair trade certification, which we had. I mean, these are all things that were not expected. Fair trade certified agricultural production maintained at a much better level than, right? So again, farm workers are exempt from almost all protections. And so the workers that did stay working throughout in person the pandemic were agricultural workers. And that was true both here in the US as well as in Mexico, which is where the vast majority of fair trade certified produce comes from. So the ability to, again, have PPE, have testing, have a lot of companies put fair trade funds into an account for things like grocery purchasing, right? Because there were much higher rates of food shortages for producer communities during the pandemic. And so having that kind of infrastructure and that additional revenue to be able to invest in keeping people safe and working, which is what all of us agricultural workers or folks with office jobs, we all would have loved to be able to maintain our regular work. So there was a lot more consistent production throughout the pandemic on fair trade certified farms. And then we've seen really encouraging continued consumer commitment coming out of the pandemic. It hasn't stayed at the exact, it hasn't been this kind of rocket ship growth curve, but it hasn't kind of dropped back off to previous levels in terms of folks that consumers and consumer studies that report the importance of sustainability in their shopping, what kind of attributes they look for, their recognition and commitment to the fair trade label. You'll see that across kind of our consumer study with Fair Trade USA, as well as Fair Trade International's consumer studies. Really encouraging continued momentum for that kind of conscious consumer segment, and not surprisingly, incredibly strong among Gen Z and millennials, who are, Gen Z in particular is really coming into their kind of economic power as a generation right now, as well as the latter millennials. And we've seen consistent commitment to fair trade and enthusiasm for sustainability across the entire millennial generation cohort as well. So positive signs, still plenty of supply chain disruptions. The other thing that we're seeing is in some of the semi-permanent goods like coffee, for example, and this isn't just fair trade, in general, sourcing of coffee is down because we had that early spike in consumption during the pandemic and then kind of leveling off. And a lot of coffee companies responded to that early spike by upping the amount of coffee they were bringing in, they were importing. And so now there are a lot of coffee companies that have a ton of supply that they have to move through before they bring in more and more volumes. So overall, the global coffee market has slowed down over the last year or so, which is very troubling for producers. And it's something that, lots of folks in fair trade are trying to figure out how to be part of the solution too. Because, these markets operate on simple supply and demand economics. And if the demand isn't there, if the supply is too high for the folks we rely on for the demand, then, then there's some real potential challenges for coffee farmers.
That's great. Thank you, Billy. Megan, would you like to ask a question next?
Do you have favorite fair trade products?
Oh, yes. Well, I have favorite products, and many of them are available as fair trade. So I am a chocolate fanatic. We were talking early on, those that got on the call very early, we were talking about Divine chocolate. Divine is one of the most inspired business models in the world, as far as I'm concerned. They're not just fair trade. The brand itself is co-owned by the Cocoa Cooperative in Ghana. Which means that they don't just make money off of their product, they make money off of the end sales of the manufactured chocolate. They're the only company that I'm aware of in the world that has that shared ownership model with the producers that grow, cultivate, and bring the cocoa to market. So, and their chocolate is extraordinary. It's just absolutely amazing. Cho chocolate is another one of my favorite fair trade chocolate brands, TCHO. They're a little bit positioned more kind of high end. They're a little bit more expensive, but also their chocolate is extraordinary. I love Equator coffees. Equator was, I believe, the first LGBT owned major coffee roaster in the country. They've been with fair trade for 20 something years, and they're growing and expanding rapidly. They started opening cafes all over. They're headquartered in the Bay Area. They now have cafes open in Los Angeles and all over California, and they're similarly just incredibly high quality coffee. I'll stop there, otherwise I'll just use up the rest of our time listing my favorite products. But those are my most important category. Oh, well, then the other I would say is almost everything I wear. I never thought this wasn't true when I started in fair trade. Every piece of clothing I'm wearing right now came out of a fair trade certified factory. So that is an extraordinary achievement I mean, fair trade certified apparel has been on the market for 11 years. So from Patagonia to Pact to newer brands like Cotopaxi and Arc'teryx, apparel that comes out of fair trade factories is amazing. And we have new types of products coming out of factories now. So Elf Cosmetics, Elf Beauty, 75% of their cosmetics are produced in fair trade factories, and they've even started now manufacturing the brushes and the cases that the makeup comes in are also coming out of fair trade factories. So they started this journey like 2 years ago. So they're making putting incredible footprint in the factory space. And then we just announced the first ever snowboards coming out of the first fair trade certified factory in the UAE, which is an incredibly important labor market to have fair trade in, because in the UAE, 95% of industrial labor is imported labor from Africa. So because the population in general is so low, but they manufacture a lot, there has been a tradition of kind of rampant trafficking. And so having the protections for workers of a fair trade certified factory is particularly important in that region. And so that's the first move into kind of outdoor hardware. The fair trade factory program had primarily been apparel and home goods up until just a couple of years ago, and we started working with Elf and now Jones Snowboards. So as you get ready for next skiing season, Jones workers are protected and making fair wages and benefiting from the fair trade movement.
I have something to say. Hi, Billy.
Hi.
I just want to correct you on the fair trade clothes. I bought my first fair trade clothes in 2003 from Marketplace India, who've been
I said
around for a really long
factories.
time.
I said factories. You're absolutely right. There has been fair trade apparel
For a long time.
For a long time. Absolutely.
And the things that I bought back then are still in good shape, which speaks volumes for the quality that one can expect. It's not a fast fashion situation. It's things that are made well that can last for decades.
And I really appreciate you bringing that forward, because fair trade handicrafts predates anything else in fair trade. It predates fair trade certification by 40 years. The concept of fair trade started by a woman from Lancaster who traveled. Edna Ruth Baker, who traveled to Puerto Rico, met artisans who were making incredible handcrafted products, and then found out what they were able to sell them for, which was like a penny a piece. And she said, that's crazy. She bought a ton of their stuff, started selling it out of her trunk, sent all the money back to those craftsmen. And that was the beginning of what turned into 10,000 villages. And that is the beginning of what turned into the fair trade movement. We didn't have actual certified commodities until the 90s. And that was 1946. So those are the deep roots of fair trade, handmade products.
We discovered some things that happened here where they had slave-free sugar and things like that back in the 1800s. There was a Quaker movement about these things that really started before Edna, but she's really the historical.
Yeah, for international trade in particular, that she is the giant whose shoulders we all stand on. So thank you for bringing that forward, Barbara.
Thank you. Billy, I think we're going to take one last question from Gemma. I believe it's very relevant for the whole audience. So Gemma, would you like to read your question? We cannot hear you.
Gemma, is it your question in the chat? I think I saw it up.
It is. I can read it.
Yeah.
How can someone who is a consumer not affiliated with business or college university get involved in the fair trade movement, campaigning, volunteering, etc. for fair trade?
Great question. And that has been one of the things we've really worked to build an easier pathway for individuals for. One of the gaps, or one of the, maybe not gaps, one of the holes in the fair trade campaigns model is that it is a team effort, right? I mean, the first goal for any of our types of campaigns is to build a team. That's not necessarily what everybody's comfortable doing, right? And so we really want to meet people where they're at and give consumers the opportunity to feel like an active part of this. Whether you happen to live in a place that has a fair trade town campaign or not, or if you happen to know other people that are interested in fair trade or not. So for somebody who becomes aware of fair trade campaigns, that map on our website is a great place to find where our campaigns are, and you can reach out to those folks directly through the website. You can find everybody's social media. There was a time where you could email people directly, but we had somebody take advantage of that and spam our audience, and so we removed that. But you can go through the campaign social media and contact folks directly that way. But at Fair Trade USA, we've built a consumer community So if you just go to fairtradecertified.org, there's a community page. You can join there. You just basically join kind of our email list, right? And it shares information, updates about fair trade, opportunities that you can tap into as a consumer. I mean, look, the easiest way is just buy the stuff. And I would say that anybody that buys a fair trade product can consider themselves part of the fair trade movement. That said, if you want to do more than the purchase, and in fair trade, we've been incredibly blessed to have thousands and thousands of people that want to do more with their impact than just purchase. Is to check that community space out and to see the programs that we have available there, ways to stay engaged, ways to learn more. And then volunteerism, that's another place where you can express interest in volunteerism if you're interested in doing that with Fair Trade USA. I'm sure the other certifiers and Fair Trade Federation have similar options. And then through Fair Trade campaigns, you can also volunteer directly. You don't have to be part of a campaign. I promise I've got plenty of work to do for fair trade campaigns in the U.S. to be able to share the load a little bit. So, if anybody's interested in just kind of volunteering as we help continue to support the national network of fair trade campaigns, I've always got opportunities for folks who are interested.
Yeah, this is great. For the sake of time, I would like to wrap up this event. I want to thank you very much for your time and for all the knowledge that you shared with us. I did put contact information for Media Fair Trade in chat and invite everybody to stay in touch and to follow Media Fair Trade on social media. And Billy, would you be willing to be contacted as well? And if so, could you please put your contact information in chat?
Yep, it's there. Yeah, feel free to reach out. And again,